Okay, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to think through the strategy used by Neal and Johnson to try to measure the effect of pre-market factors on black-white wage inequality, and therefore back out the potential effect of discrimination on black-white wage inequality. So as we talked about, they're going to use actually a very simple strategy, which is essentially that they're going to take a single measure of likely labor force productivity measured before black and white youth enter the labor force, and see how much of the black-white wage inequality they observe later, in particular when those youths are in their late 20s, can be explained by that single measure of productivity. And their argument is essentially that by using indicators of productivity measured before children enter the labor force, before future workers enter the labor force, they're going to get away from the possibility of accidentally including factors related to discrimination, like access to employment, in their measure of productivity effects on wages. So to think through this, I want to start by just considering a cartoon version of the world where there's just black workers and white workers, and the only things that matter for workers' productivity are a single measure of productivity P and some constant level of discrimination faced by all black workers. In other words, if we want to think about an individual's earnings, we'll say that an individual's earnings are given by earnings for person I are equal to P of I, where P is productivity, minus D times an indicator of whether person I is black, and then plus an error term. So essentially what this means, if you're white, you're just paid based on your productivity. If you're black, you're paid based on your productivity minus a single constant discrimination factor. So let's say that we tried to understand these earnings with a regression that just included an indicator for whether you're black. So let's say we said earnings for person I are equal to beta naught plus beta 1 times black. So in this case, plus error. So in this case, as we've talked about before, beta naught would equal the average earnings if you're white, right? So the average earnings of white workers, beta naught plus beta 1, would equal the average earnings of black workers. And what that means is, right, beta 1 is going to measure the difference in earnings between black and white workers. And so it's going to equal minus D plus the productivity difference, the average productivity difference between black and white workers. Right? So if we imagine that the discrimination penalty was something like $2,000 a year, and the average productivity difference between black and white workers was something like $3,000 a year, we would end up estimating a beta 1 that was equal to 5,000. Right? So beta 1 is going to measure the full wage gap between black workers and white workers. It's going to include the effect of discrimination, but it's also going to include the effect of productivity differences. So now let's imagine that we had a perfect measure of your productivity P. So we could run a regression like earnings equals beta naught plus beta 1 times black plus beta 2 times P. Right? So we're trying to explain an individual's earnings now with their race plus their productivity. So in this case, what beta 1 is going to measure is the difference between black and white workers' expected earnings, given that they have the same productivity, or after accounting for productivity. So beta 1 is going to be the difference between black and white workers' earnings after accounting for productivity differences. Right? In other words, it's going to tell you how much my guess about your earnings will change if I learn that you're black, if I already knew how productive you were. And so as a result, B1 would just equal negative D, right? B1 would just measure the effect of discrimination. It would not include the differences in average productivity between black workers and white workers. But of course, this is a really unrealistic regression, right? There's really no way that we could ever perfectly measure your labor market productivity. In fact, the best way that we would have to do so is to look at how much you can earn, right? Look at your wages. It'd be very, very difficult for us to even imagine approximating measuring every aspect of your productivity. So instead, what Neal and Johnson do is they say, what if instead of this regression, where we actually know your productivity, what if instead we had a test that was an indicator of your productivity? So how does this story change? Can we get to an unbiased estimate of D with just a test indicating your productivity? And their argument is we can, as long as we have the following condition. So then we'll say B1, unbiased, if. So what we need is that our expected productivity given that we see that you have a certain test score and you're black, is going to equal your expected productivity given that you have that test score and you're white. In other words, what we need is that we have some test of your labor market productivity so that if we saw your test score, we wouldn't learn anything more about how productive you are by seeing your race. And they're going to call this a non-racially biased test. So why is this important? Because if we have this condition, and I want to know how is my guess about your earnings going to change if I already know your test score and then I learn your race, if I have a racially unbiased test, according to this definition, then learning your race doesn't teach me anything more about your productivity if I already know your test score. And so I'll only change my guess about your earnings on the basis of the discrimination that you're likely to face. So if this is true, then beta 1 will equal negative B. If this isn't true, so if, for example, we would expect that a black applicant with a certain test score would have a lower productivity on average than a white applicant with that test score, then we would overestimate discrimination. On the other hand, if we thought that a black applicant with a certain test score probably had a higher level of productivity than a white applicant with the same test score, we would underestimate discrimination. And the reason is the same in both cases, and it's that if we don't have a racially unbiased test, we'll learn something about your productivity by observing your race, even if we already know your test score. So if we're going to separate out the role of productivity from the role of discrimination in understanding wage gaps between black and white workers or white and Hispanic workers, what we need is a racially unbiased test of productivity. So the question is the test that Neal and Johnson used, the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, racially unbiased? And remember, what that would mean is if you saw that a white applicant had a certain score and a black applicant had that same score, you would predict them to have the same level of labor market productivity. You would expect them to be just as good at labor market tasks. So to think through this, let's spend a minute talking about what the Armed Forces Qualifying Test is and what it's supposed to measure. So essentially the AFQT, or Armed Forces Qualifying Test, is a test given to all new recruits for the US military. And its job is to determine recruits' aptitude in various mathematical, written and verbal comprehension tasks. So it's very similar in its setup as a multiple choice test and in its objectives to the SAT or the ACT. What that means is, and this is really, really crucial for understanding this, the AFQT is not intended to be and is not an IQ test. It is not measuring something like a person's raw intelligence. It's measuring skills that can be and should be learned through schooling. And this is going to be crucial for understanding this paper. It's also crucial to avoid some really horrific social science errors that have been made treating the AFQT as if it was an IQ test. So the reason that Neal and Johnson argue that this test is likely to be racially unbiased is that the military has gone to pretty great lengths to design a test that's racially unbiased and to test the racial bias of the test. In particular, what they've done is they've taken new recruits who have various AFQT scores and then judged them on their actual ability to accomplish a series of very specific tasks that the military determines are necessary for example, a Marine Corps infantryman. And because of the fact that these tests can be reasonably objective, more objective, for instance, than a supervisor saying whether you're good at your job or not, they feel that it's reasonable to validate the AFQT by seeing whether black applicants and white applicants, or sorry, black recruits and white recruits with the same score did as well as each other on these military aptitude challenges. And the general finding of these military evaluations of the AFQT is that it is in fact racially unbiased for measuring those sorts of skills. In other words, if you want to guess whether someone is going to do well in a physical test, in a practical test of their ability to be a Marine Corps infantryman, the AFQT is racially unbiased. So just to highlight the point that the AFQT is measuring learned skills and is not an IQ test, again, not at all an IQ test, we can look at the fact at the differences in average scores between Black, white, and Hispanic men and women, both in a younger cohort and in an older cohort. So as you can see, for people who take the test younger, the differences by race are smaller than in people who take the test older, right? The difference for Black men, for example, Black men go from being 40 points behind white men on average to being 46 points behind white men on average. This is something you would expect if a test is measuring learned skills and the learning environments of Black and Hispanic youth are worse than the learning environments of white youth. This is not something you would expect if this was measuring innate intelligence or innate ability. So let's say that we believe the military's evidence that the AFQT is a racially unbiased test of new recruits' performance on a day-long battery of trials designed to determine your aptitude for the infantry. So we should think of this as similar to, let's say that you were going to try out for a show on Broadway, right? You'd have the singing contest, you would have to show off your dancing skills, you'd have to show off your acting skills, and then at the end they would give you an overall evaluation of your ability as a Broadway performer. Right? Or if you're going to try out for the NBA, right? You've got to show whether you can dribble, you can show whether you can shoot. At the end, they're going to give you an evaluation. We're going to have a similar sort of day-long test of your ability to be in the infantry. And let's say that the AFQT, this multiple choice test, does as good a job predicting your skills if you're Black and if you're white. Is that enough for us to believe that it's also going to be a racially unbiased predictor of your labor market productivity? So to think through this, let's think about all of the things that matter for your labor market productivity. So of course, one of the important factors for labor market productivity is going to be your cognitive skills, the kind of things that are measured by a test like the AFQT. Right? If we thought of this as equivalent to your SAT score, it's of course going to matter if you have high levels of analytical reasoning ability, or you're very good at reading comprehension, right? Or you are very good at math. All of those are going to be important and useful. But it's also going to be important whether you are easy to get along with, right? Whether you have good emotional intelligence. It's going to matter whether you have grit, right? It's going to matter whether you fall apart the first time that you hit adversity or the first time that your boss criticizes you for something. It's going to matter whether you can show up to work on time. In other words, in addition to all of these things that could potentially be tested by something like the AFQT, all of these cognitive skills, you're also going to have a whole bunch of non-cognitive skills that are equally important. And it's important to note those non-cognitive skills not only are unlikely to be tested by something like the AFQT, they're also unlikely to be tested by this sort of military infantryman tryout that the US military used to validate the AFQT, right? If we were going to cast a Broadway show, we wouldn't guess your ability to show up to practice every day and work on your lines and take criticism well based on your performance in auditions, right? We would have to base that on some sort of a longer term test. So let's imagine that your earnings now, instead of just being a function of a single kind of productivity, are going to be a function of your cognitive abilities plus your non-cognitive abilities And then again, discrimination, right? So now we've got cognitive abilities that we think might be measured in a racially unbiased way by something like the AFQT, and we have non-cognitive abilities. So what do we need to believe now to believe that a single test is going to do a good job of capturing this? In other words, if we have this real model of the world, and then we say, we're going to run a regression that looks like beta naught plus beta 1 times black plus beta 2 times t, and we believe that t is racially unbiased for c, right? So we have the expectation of ci given ti in black equals your expectation of c given ti in white. Is this going to be sufficient? Well, the question would then be, remember what this is telling us is, if I know your test score, observing your race doesn't change my guess about your cognitive abilities. So the question would be, does observing your race after I've seen your test score tell me anything about your non-cognitive abilities? So let's imagine, just to start out with, that we think the following are true. Let's imagine that your cognitive abilities and non-cognitive abilities are correlated. So the higher your cognitive abilities are, the higher our guess is going to be of your non-cognitive abilities, right? We generally think people who are good at getting out of bed on time and working through adversity are also going to learn more calculus, right? Let's also imagine that the difference between average cognitive abilities between black and white workers is bigger than the difference between average non-cognitive abilities. So the black-white gap in CI is bigger than the black-white gap in non-cognitive abilities, right? So we might think that this is the case if, for example, having access to lower quality schools or more dangerous neighborhoods does more to limit your ability to learn analytical skills or academic skills than it does to limit your ability to learn character development or grit or social skills or any of these things that matter. So in this case, if we first observe your test score and we make a guess about your cognitive ability, the higher we guess your cognitive ability is going to be, the higher we guess your non-cognitive ability is going to be, right? And another way to say this is if we see that you have a low test score, we'll guess that you have a low cognitive ability and thus a low non-cognitive ability. If we then see that you're black rather than white, we're going to say, oh, well, if you're black, the gap between your cognitive ability and the average cognitive ability of black and white workers is going to be larger than the gap between non-cognitive ability between black and white workers. So we're likely to update our guess up about your non-cognitive abilities. In other words, what this is likely to lead to is our expectations of your non-cognitive abilities, given a test score, and given that you're black, are going to be greater than our expectation about your cognitive abilities. Non-cognitive abilities, given the test score and that you're white. Right, what we're saying is, because black workers are less disadvantaged in non-cognitive abilities on average than cognitive abilities, then what we expect is that given a certain cognitive ability, a black worker is likely to have a higher non-cognitive ability than would a similar white worker. And what this is going to lead to is it's going to lead to an underestimate of racial bias, because this beta 1 is going to include both negative D, both the effect of racial bias, but is also going to include this positive assessment of your likely non-cognitive abilities. So beta 1 is going to be biased upwards because your overall abilities, right, if we've got an unbiased test of your cognitive abilities, given these assumptions, we actually end up with a racially biased test of your overall productivity because of the fact that we're going to underestimate black workers' non-cognitive abilities. So then what do we need in order to believe that the AFQT is racially unbiased as a measure of overall productivity? We basically need two things. We need one of two things. The first possibility is the AFQT is an unbiased measure of everything that matters for a worker's productivity. Right? So it's not just an unbiased test of cognitive ability, it's also an unbiased test of non-cognitive ability, it's an unbiased test of social connections, and all of these other things that determine whether a worker is productive. Or the racial achievement gaps in measured factors are as big as in unmeasured factors. In other words, if we believe that the AFQT is just measuring cognitive ability, we could still have the AFQT be an unbiased estimate of a worker's overall productivity and not racially biased estimate if average racial differences in non-cognitive skills were exactly the same size as average racial differences in cognitive skills. And likewise, average racial differences in any other set of characteristics that determine how productive a worker is going to be. And because those are very, very strong assumptions, it's likely that the strategy used in this paper is going to either underestimate or overestimate the role of discrimination in black-white wage inequality. It'll be an overestimate. It'll overestimate discrimination if the wage gaps and the things that if the racial gaps and the things that AFQT do measure are smaller than the gaps and things that AFQT doesn't measure. It's going to be an underestimate of the role of discrimination if the racial gaps and the things that AFQT does measure are larger than the gaps and the things that AFQT doesn't measure. Okay, so this is probably the most important and most significant challenge faced by this paper. And it's a challenge that is in a lot of ways impossible to get around, because the criticisms that these authors use of other papers that try to decompose average earnings between discrimination and other factors are absolutely spot on. But in order for this strategy to work, we need this incredibly strong assumption of racially unbiased tests. And the only way I can imagine that assumption being satisfied would be if we used a large enough set of measures of somebody's characteristics at age 18 to really cover the entire spectrum of everything that matters for labor market productivity. And that's just pretty much impossible to imagine. So the challenge we just talked about, the challenge of trying to find a racially unbiased test of worker productivity, is by far the most serious challenge to any approach like the one in this paper. But there's another challenge that's worth a little bit of time thinking about, because it's such a big problem for any research agenda, any research you want to do that uses workers' wages or workers' earnings. And that's the problem of labor force participation. So let's imagine that we completely ignored the problems we just talked about with using the AFQT. Let's imagine that we believe that the AFQT was a racially unbiased indicator of a worker's productivity. In that case, are we safe with this regression strategy? In that case, are we safe saying earnings equal Are we safe running this regression? The answer is not really. And the problem here is we're only going to be able to observe earnings for people who are working. In other words, if somebody's out of the labor force, either because they are not happy with the wages that they were offered or for some other reason, we're not going to observe their earnings. The reason that this is going to be a problem is because we're generally going to expect that the people who don't work are going to have worse wage offers than the people who do. And as a result, we're going to bias when we look at this average earnings here between black workers and white workers, those averages are going to be biased upwards as an indication of the wages available or possible to potential workers. To think about this, let's imagine that we were going to make a graph of the distribution of wage offers to black workers and white workers. So let's imagine we have black workers getting wage offers like this. Imagine this is a normal distribution, and white workers are getting wage offers like this. So let's imagine these are wage offers given some constant test score and some constant productivity, right? So we've got black and white workers that are the same in every way, except for discrimination. Because of discrimination, the distribution of wages for black workers is shifted down, right? So let's just say shifted down by $5, right? So let's say that the average wage for black workers, wage offer is $9. Average wage for white workers is $14. On top of this, let's imagine that there's some minimum wage that absolutely no one will accept. So we've got some wage here. Let's call this $5 an hour. And nobody below here will work. Right? Everyone over here will work. Well, the consequence of this is going to be there's going to be a large number of black workers and a very small number of white workers who decide not to work because they were offered too low of wages. And when we look, as a result of this, only at the wages of workers who did choose to work, our average wage for black workers is going to be shifted. Right? The average wage for black workers who work is going to be higher than the average wage offered to all black workers. That's going to be true of white workers as well, but because of the fact that so few white workers were offered a wage below $5 an hour, right, that shift for white workers is going to be a lot smaller than the shift for black workers. So instead of estimating a discrimination level of $5 an hour, maybe instead we would end up estimating a discrimination level of $3.50 or $4 or something smaller. Right, so the fundamental problem here is, it's not just that we're not observing everyone, it's not that we don't have everyone's earnings, it's that we have missing earnings data in a way that's non-random. In particular, that the lower your wage offers are, the more likely you are not to work. And as a result, we're going to lose the lowest earning black workers, we're not going to lose the lowest earning white workers. So we can see evidence of this happening when we look at the likelihood of working male labor force participations among black and white workers with different AFQT scores. So what you can see here is that among workers with the highest AFQT scores, right, who are half a standard deviation above the average or more, labor force participation rates are very similar for black and white workers, for black and white men. In fact, they're a little bit higher for black men than for white men. But if we look at lower scoring individuals, right, those who are more than half a standard deviation below average, or those who are kind of in this average range, there's lower labor force participation rates for black men than for white men. And that's what we would expect if we had a story like this. So how would we go about solving this problem? How can we adjust our strategy here to account for the possibility that essentially we're losing the lowest earning members of our sample, and that's going to reduce the black sample by more than the white sample, and therefore bias average black earnings up relative to white earnings? What they do is they say, let's take this strategy seriously, let's take this story seriously, and instead of looking at average earnings, which are going to be biased, let's look at median earnings. And in order to calculate our median earnings, let's just assume, even though we don't know what these people who didn't work would have been offered in wages, since we don't see what wage they took, let's assume that they were offered something below the median. So we'll take all of the members of our sample, Black, white, and Hispanic, who aren't working, and assign them a wage of 1 cent an hour, right, or earnings of 1 cent a year, essentially assign them the lowest possible earnings. And because we're going to look only at median wages, that's only going to affect our estimates insofar as it's going to be below median for everyone. So what they're going to say, right, if we don't need to measure if we don't need to know your actual earnings, we can at the very least know that you're earning below average or below median, and therefore we can include all of these people who are dropped back into our sample. And by doing that, right, by looking at the effect of test score and race on median earnings, they're going to be able to account for this bias. And the key assumption they need to do this, right, the people who drop out of the labor force have below median earnings. Okay, so just to sum up where we've left ourselves, right, we've said that the key challenge here is being able to believe that the AFQT is a racially unbiased indicator of your likely future productivity. And then we've got the secondary challenge that they can sort of deal with for men, but they can't really deal with for women, which is that they need to adjust for your likelihood of being in the labor force. In the next video, we'll look at what they find, and we'll talk a little bit about how to interpret these results, particularly in light of the fact that, as we've talked about, this strategy is a little bit challenging.